The clinking of champagne flutes and the low, throbbing bass of a forgotten 90s track were supposed to set a celebratory mood, but for me they only amplified the tension in the air. I stood near the edge of the ballroom, nursing a glass of Riesling that tasted far too sweet for the moment. The room was a shimmering sea of tailored suits and cocktail dresses, a monument to 2 decades of professional striving, or at least the appearance of it. Then the sound came, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the general hum of conversation. Laughter. Not polite social laughter, but the kind that carries weight and intent, designed to land on a specific target. "Tessa Ward still drives that old Honda?" The voice was high-pitched and familiar, carrying across the polished floor. It was Heather, of course, standing with a clutch of women who looked like they'd just stepped off a yacht, all tight smiles and expensive jewelry. I felt the collective shift in attention. Suddenly, every eye in the room, from the former jocks to the quiet bookworms, was focused entirely on me. They were all looking at the woman who hadn't quite managed to escape the gravity of her starting point. My wine glass began to tremble almost imperceptibly in my hand, a tiny earthquake of contained fury. The joke was meaner than it had any right to be, delivered with the practiced cruelty of people who have never had to worry about where their next car payment was coming from. My throat constricted, a familiar burning sensation that I hadn't felt in years. It was the old shame trying to claw its way back up. But I had spent too long building my walls to let them crumble now. I took a slow sip of the wine, forcing the corners of my mouth into a thin, impenetrable smile. They didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing my reaction. Not yet. They deserved nothing but the carefully curated blankness I presented. The storm was contained. The reckoning was still hours away, but the first drop of rain had already fallen. I just needed to maintain this facade of indifference until the critical moment arrived. "My name is Tessa Ward and I am 45 years old." The woman standing here, poised and impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than my first 2 months' rent back in the day, is a carefully constructed monument. The composure you see now is not natural. It is the result of years of brutal self-training, a shield forged in the fires of humiliation. But there was a time not so long ago when that laughter, the kind that echoed just moments ago, would have shattered me entirely. It would have sent me scurrying for the nearest exit, the sound ringing in my ears for weeks. I wasn't always this controlled. There was a time when the mere suggestion of failure or visibility sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I can pinpoint the exact moment I realized that being poor didn't just mean struggling financially. It meant being invisible, or worse, being a public punchline. It started subtly, a slow erosion of self-worth that chipped away at my confidence until I believed their assessment of me was accurate. The world, particularly the privileged microcosm of our high school, had decided early on that I was a secondary character, a background figure whose struggles were simply fodder for their entertainment. They didn't see the double shifts, the constant calculation of every penny, the exhaustion that lived permanently behind my eyes. They only saw the cheap clothes and the hand-me-down car. And because they saw those things, they felt entitled to judge, to dismiss, and most painfully to laugh. That first sting of realizing that poverty meant invisibility was a profound trauma. It taught me a lesson that no textbook ever could. In their world, currency wasn't just money, it was respect, and I had none. The memory surfaced now, vivid and sickeningly clear, pulling me back across 2 decades. Senior year. The high school cafeteria always smelled the same, a pungent mix of industrial bleach, lukewarm pizza grease, and teenage desperation. I remember standing there, balancing a tray piled high with the cheapest items available, the weight of the ceramic plates feeling monumental. I had just finished a punishing 4-hour shift at the local diner, my uniform still faintly smelling of stale coffee and fryer oil, and I was starving. I scanned the room for an empty seat, hoping to disappear into a corner to eat the meager meal I could afford and get back to studying. I spotted an open spot at a large central table, a place where the social elite usually held court, but they seemed to have dispersed that day. As I approached, Heather, the undisputed queen bee, materialized out of nowhere, blocking my path with a sneer that was already fully formed and practiced. Her hair was perfectly glossy, her clothes expensive, and her gaze was utterly dismissive. "Don't sit here, Ward," she commanded, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "This table is for actual students, not charity cases trying to leech off the school's goodwill." The implication was clear. I didn't belong, my presence was an offense, and my need was a stain on their perfect social fabric. The laughter that followed was instant and brutal, a chorus of conformity. I stood frozen, my tray shaking so violently that the milk carton rattled. My cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. It was pure, unadulterated shame. I remember gripping the edges of the tray so tightly my knuckles went white, pretending with every fiber of my being that I hadn't heard her, that I didn't care. I managed to pivot slowly, retreating to a cramped and used table by the waste bins, the echoing sound of their amusement chasing me all the way. That day I learned the geography of my social standing. Always near the refuse, always invisible unless I was being ridiculed. I had always believed that talent and hard work were the ultimate equalizers. My escape route was simple: art. I lived and breathed design, spending every spare moment sketching, painting, and building a portfolio that was my ticket out of that suffocating environment. The culmination of this effort was the acceptance letter from my dream art school, a prestigious academy in New York City. That letter, thick and embossed, felt like a golden key in my hand. For a few glorious weeks I walked on air. I was going to be an artist, a creator, someone who mattered. My parents, practical and perpetually tired, were cautiously proud. We celebrated with a cheap cake and weak coffee, clinging to that brief, precious hope. Then the financial aid package arrived, and the reality of my situation slammed into me like a physical blow. The scholarship, the one I had banked everything on, was only partial. The remaining tuition and living expenses were astronomical, insurmountable. My mother, usually stoic, sat at the kitchen table and cried, silent, heavy tears rolling down her worn face. She kept apologizing, murmuring about how hard they had tried. My father, who had worked manual labor since he was 16, just shook his head, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Maybe college isn't for everyone, Tessa," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was the sound of surrender. In that moment something essential collapsed inside me. It wasn't just the loss of the school. It was the loss of the entire future I had meticulously planned. I felt the first of many silent funerals for my dreams. I packed away my portfolio, tucking the acceptance letter into the bottom of a box, burying the potential person I could have been. The world had told me very clearly that hard work wasn't enough. Money was the gatekeeper, and I was standing outside, locked out and forgotten. The years after high school were a blur of practical compromise. Art school was out, but I couldn't abandon design completely. I took online courses, taught myself the necessary software, and eventually, through sheer grit, landed a junior designer position at a small mid-tier marketing firm in the city. It wasn't a dream job, but it was a paycheck, and it was creative. I thrived there, pouring all the deferred ambition from my lost art school days into corporate branding and ad campaigns. My boss, a decent man named Mr. Chin, recognized my talent. He frequently praised my concepts, especially a complex, year-long rebranding project for a major pharmaceutical client that I had painstakingly developed. I had worked nights and weekends on that proposal, convinced this was my chance to finally move up, to earn a salary that would lift my family out of the constant financial anxiety. Then, during the review period for a senior promotion, the betrayal hit. The firm hosted a presentation showcasing the top candidates' work. I watched, stunned, as Heather, who had somehow landed in the same company a year prior, walked to the podium. She stood beside a massive screen displaying my rebranding concept, my color palette, my tagline, my entire strategic layout. She delivered the presentation with polished confidence, never once mentioning my name. When she finished, the applause was deafening. Mr. Chin looked confused, but the partners were impressed. A week later, Heather received the promotion and the substantial raise that came with it. I received a sterile, impersonal email from HR informing me that my position was being eliminated due to restructuring. The pink slip felt like a physical blow, a piece of paper that erased months of my life. She had done it again, taken what was mine not through superior skill but through sheer entitlement and malice. I remember the sensation of the rough, cold concrete against my legs, the sound of the rain intensifying from a drizzle to a downpour. I was sitting on the curb directly outside the firm's glass tower, the portfolio that contained all my hope and effort clutched uselessly in my lap. The rain was relentless, soaking through the cheap fabric of my suit jacket and turning the meticulously organized pages of my work into soggy, useless pulp. Everything I had built since the high school embarrassment, the late nights, the self-teaching, the sheer volume of effort, was dissolving right there in the gutter. The pink slip was still tucked into my pocket, a constant, sharp reminder of my failure to protect myself. I felt utterly depleted, hollowed out. I couldn't move. I just sat there watching the water pool around my shoes, feeling like the entire world was washing me away. A man, dressed in expensive business attire, walked past holding an umbrella. He glanced down at me, saw the slumped posture, the drenched clothes, and the defeated expression. Without pausing his stride, he reached into his pocket and dropped a crumpled dollar bill directly into the cup of lukewarm coffee I was holding, clearly mistaking me for someone begging on the street. The sound of the coin hitting the bottom of the paper cup was a small, definitive clink that echoed in the silence of my despair. That was the absolute, crushing, unequivocal low point. I wasn't just unemployed. I was reduced, in the eyes of the world, to a pathetic object of pity. I was not Tessa Ward, designer. I was just another casualty of the street, unworthy of even eye contact. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, a final, suffocating lesson in humiliation. The dollar bill sat on my kitchen counter that night, still damp from the rain, a grotesque monument to my failure. I stared at it for a long time, the fluorescent light of the cramped studio apartment reflecting dully off the paper. I felt the breakdown receding, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The tears had stopped. The panic had vanished. All that remained was a steel-hard resolve. That crumpled bill was the catalyst. I will never beg for approval, pity, or survival again, I vowed, the words silent but ringing in my ears like a sacred oath. I pushed the portfolio, now ruined, aside. I had nothing left to lose, which ironically meant I had everything to gain. The first step was purely pragmatic, stripped of emotion. I went through the few meager possessions I still owned. I found the last piece of jewelry my grandmother had given me, a thin, antique silver locket. It was precious, sentimental, and completely impractical. I pawned it the next morning for just enough cash to cover a month's rent and, more importantly, to buy a refurbished laptop from a dingy electronics shop downtown. The laptop was slow, the screen was slightly cracked, but it worked. I spent the next 72 hours drinking bad coffee and building a new foundation. I didn't apply for jobs. I didn't network. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I was going underground. I started freelancing immediately, taking any small anonymous gig I could find, logo design, website mockups, anything to practice and earn. I didn't want visibility, I wanted results. The fire had been lit, fueled by the memory of that dollar bill and the rain-soaked curb. I was done being a victim. I was starting over, quietly, ruthlessly, from the bottom up. My new identity required a mask of corporate legitimacy, a shield to protect the raw, vulnerable person working behind the screen. I christened my operation Ward Creative Agency. The name was intentionally vague, suggesting a team, a structure, a level of professionalism that belied the reality. It was just me. I was the CEO, the janitor, the accountant, and the sole creative director, all operating out of the suffocating confines of my tiny studio apartment, which smelled perpetually of instant ramen and overheated electronics. The anonymity was key. I never met clients in person, insisting all communication happen via video conference or professional email chains. This allowed me to control the narrative entirely. I learned to speak the language of success fluently, even when I was shivering under a threadbare blanket because I couldn't afford to run the heat constantly. I studied the corporate jargon, the tone of authority, the subtle ways successful people communicated confidence. I designed a sleek, minimalist website that looked like it belonged to a firm operating in a Manhattan high-rise, not a fifth-floor walk-up. Within months, clients started responding positively. They loved my work ethic, the speed of my turnaround, and the sharp, effective quality of my designs. They didn't know I was the broke girl from high school. They only knew Ward Creative delivered results. I was building a reputation based purely on output, free from the baggage of my past. I was a ghost, a successful phantom operating just beneath the surface of the professional world, slowly and silently accumulating power. The moment the wire transfer hit my account remains one of the most visceral memories of my life. I had landed a large, complex campaign for a tech startup, my first truly significant contract. They were disorganized and demanding, but I delivered everything on time, exceeding their expectations. The final invoice was $25,000. I remember sitting at my rickety desk, staring at the bank notification on the screen. The number glowed back at me, stark and beautiful. For a full minute I simply couldn't process it. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place, more than my parents made in half a year. Then the dam broke. I didn't cheer or jump up. I cried. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing uncontrollably in the dark, silent apartment. It wasn't the relief of the money itself that brought the tears. It was the realization that it was mine. Every single pixel, every late night spent hunched over the keyboard, every moment of self-doubt overcome, it had all culminated in this tangible validation. This money wasn't a handout, a scholarship, or a stolen project. It was the direct, undeniable fruit of my labor. I had earned it. I had proven that I didn't need their approval, their tables, or their charity. I was self-sufficient. That financial freedom was intoxicating, but the emotional freedom it represented was truly priceless. It was the moment I stopped being Tessa the victim and fully became Tessa the architect of her own destiny. That night, I celebrated by splurging on a carton of expensive ice cream, eating it slowly, savoring the taste of hard-won victory. For 10 years I maintained my ghost status. It was a deliberate strategy of calculated invisibility. While my former classmates were climbing corporate ladders in highly visible roles, attending industry conferences and posting endless updates on social media about their promotions and expensive vacations, I was burrowed deep in the trenches of my own business. They were building careers. I was building an empire, brick by silent brick. I watched their progress from a distance, noting their trajectories, their companies, and their perceived successes. They were visible, they were traceable, they were vulnerable to public scrutiny. I, on the other hand, was an enigma. Ward Creative Agency grew exponentially, fueled entirely by word-of-mouth referrals and a reputation for unparalleled discretion and quality. I hired a small remote team, all bound by strict NDAs, none of whom knew the true extent of the company's founder's past, or her current wealth. My classmates rose to mid-level executive positions in companies I never applied to. I quietly started acquiring the smaller firms they dismissed. They posted photos of their success. I focused on compounding my assets and perfecting my craft. Nobody knew that the broke girl who drove the beat-up Honda, the one they had laughed out of the cafeteria and stolen a promotion from, was slowly, meticulously becoming a multimillionaire. The silence was my greatest weapon, allowing me to observe the playing field without becoming a target. I was the shadow investor, the silent partner, the successful entity they never had to acknowledge because they never knew she existed. The message arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, indistinguishable from the dozens of other corporate inquiries that flooded Ward Creative's inbox daily. I was reviewing quarterly financials, the kind of dry, heavy reading that now occupied most of my time. The subject line was standard: inquiry regarding corporate rebranding and merger integration. My administrative assistant, who screened all initial contacts, had flagged it as high priority due to the size of the corporations involved. I scrolled down to the body of the email, my professional focus unwavering, until I saw the names listed under the merger documents. Two major firms were combining, creating a powerhouse in the consumer goods sector. They needed a complete overhaul of their brand identity to manage the integration. One of the companies listed, the acquiring firm, was instantly recognizable. It was the same one Heather had joined years ago, the one where she had stolen my project and secured her promotion. My pulse quickened, a sudden sharp jolt that broke through my decade of practiced calm. The irony was so profound it felt like a cosmic joke. Her company, the one that had been built partially on the ruins of my early career, was now in dire need of salvation. And they had reached out to the best in the business, the agency that was now synonymous with successful high-stakes corporate overhauls. They had reached out to Ward Creative. They had reached out to me. I stared at the signature line of the initial email, the blood draining from my face. Heather Marks, Chief Brand Officer. The title was impressive, the email address corporate and sterile. But the name, that specific combination of letters, made my hands go cold. The girl who had laughed at me for being a charity case, the woman who had submitted my life's work as her own to secure her place, was now professionally reaching out to me, to my agency, for help. The stakes of this contract were immense. 6 figures, guaranteed, and the sort of high-profile work that would cement Ward Creative's place at the very top of the industry. But the money was secondary. The primary feeling was a dizzying blend of shock and intoxicating poetic irony. She was about to pay me a fortune to fix the public image of the company that was her entire professional identity. It was a perfect self-contained loop of karma. I didn't respond immediately. I sat there in the silence of my expansive office, the city glittering far below, contemplating the sheer audacity of the universe's timing. Accepting this contract meant walking directly back into her orbit willingly. It meant shedding the cloak of invisibility I had so carefully worn for 10 years. It meant confrontation. I could decline, citing a conflict of interest or simply being overbooked and maintain my peace. But the thought of that past humiliation, the betrayal, the memory of that dollar bill on the wet pavement, gnawed at me. The silence in the office felt pregnant, the calm before an inevitable storm. I spent the next 48 hours in a rigorous internal debate. The professional voice in my head screamed caution. Don't engage. It's risky. Maintain your distance. The rational side pointed out that this contract was a massive opportunity, regardless of who was signing the paperwork. But the deep, quiet voice, the one forged on the curb in the rain, whispered a different imperative: justice. I thought of every whispered insult, every slammed door, every moment I had been made to feel small and worthless. I had achieved success, yes, but I had never truly closed the chapter on that specific, searing humiliation. Walking away now would be safe, but it would also be a final surrender of the narrative. It would mean that Heather and her ilk would never truly know who they had wronged. I realized that true revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about undeniable visibility at the precise moment of their weakness. I wouldn't just fix her company's image, I would control it. I would become the indispensable force she had to rely on, the quiet power behind her throne. The decision solidified, cold and resolute. No, I wouldn't walk away from the table. I would walk straight through the center of the room, calm, smiling, and utterly unstoppable. I drafted the reply, my fingers flying across the keyboard with renewed purpose. It was polite, professional, and entirely non-committal about the identity of the agency's CEO. Ward Creative Agency would be delighted to submit a full proposal, I wrote. The game had officially begun. 2 weeks after securing the contract with Heather's firm, a process handled entirely by my COO, keeping my identity safely shielded, the invitation arrived. It was printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock, tucked into a thick envelope bearing the elegant script of the reunion committee. Class of 2000 reunion, celebrating 25 years of success. I picked up the invitation from my desk, turning it over in my hands. The timing was so exquisitely perfect, so perfectly timed to the unfolding corporate drama, that I actually laughed out loud, a genuine, unburdened sound that startled my assistant in the next room. It was a divine comedian orchestrating the final act. Here I was about to become the essential six-figure vendor for Heather Marks's entire professional operation, and simultaneously, I was being invited to a celebration designed to showcase her visible success against my assumed failure. It was the perfect stage, the ultimate convergence of my past life and my current reality. The reunion wasn't just a social event. It was a performance, and I realized I had the opportunity to deliver the most stunning, subversive monologue of my life. I didn't hesitate. I walked over to my private secretary holding the heavy cardstock. Please ensure this is sent immediately, I instructed, a smile playing on my lips. I watched her check off the appropriate box. RSVP, yes. The old Tessa would have hidden, citing a scheduling conflict or feigning indifference. The new Tessa understood that the greatest revenge is not refusing to play the game, but rewriting the rules of the game and winning so decisively that the opposition can never forget the moment of their defeat. The preparation for the reunion was less about vanity and more about strategy. I didn't want to look merely rich. Anyone can buy expensive clothes. I wanted to look untouchable. I hired a stylist, a meticulous professional who understood that projection of power is quieter than projection of wealth. We discarded the notion of flashy designer logos or overtly trendy pieces. Instead, we focused on structure, material, and fit. The resulting ensemble was a deep navy suit, tailored with such precision that it felt less like clothing and more like a second skin, a suit of psychological armor. The fabric was heavy, the lines were clean, and the overall effect was one of absolute, unassailable competence. I also decided it was time for a physical transformation that matched the internal one. My hair, which I had kept long and practical for years, was cut into a sharp asymmetrical bob, strong, modern, and severe. It was a haircut that demanded respect and suggested efficiency. As I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror, I saw not the scared, broke girl who used to hide in oversized sweaters, but a sea. My expression was calibrated, cool, calm, and utterly devoid of need. Every detail, from the minimalist watch to the subtle, expensive scent, was designed to convey one message. I am not just successful. I am powerful, and you have no access to my emotions. The transformation was complete. The armor was on. I was ready to walk into the arena. Walking into the reunion hall was not an act of bravery. It was an exercise in pure, cold calculation. I wasn't nervous. I was analyzing the room, processing every face, every reaction. The hall was even more opulent than the invitation suggested, filled with the loud, slightly desperate cheerfulness of people trying too hard to prove they'd won at life. I moved slowly, deliberately, allowing myself to be seen without seeking attention. Every face I passed was a ghost of humiliation past. The boy who tripped me in the hall, the girl who spread the meanest rumors, the teachers who looked through me. I smiled at them all. The smile was crucial, polite, distant, and utterly unreadable. They saw the expensive suit, the confident posture, the undeniable air of success, but they couldn't place it. They were confused. They remembered the Tessa Ward who was supposed to be struggling, perhaps working retail or living paycheck to paycheck. This woman didn't fit their narrative. I caught a few whispers. Is that Tessa? She looks different. They saw the smile, the facade of polite engagement, but they couldn't detect the storm brewing beneath the surface, the precise purpose of my attendance. I made my way to the bar, ordered a glass of water, and took a position that allowed me to observe the entire room, particularly the table where Heather and her inner circle were holding court. I was the quiet predator, observing the prey, waiting for the precise, perfect moment to strike. I had waited 10 years for this. A few more minutes wouldn't hurt. The moment of direct contact was inevitable, and Heather, predictably, initiated it. She spotted me across the room, her eyes narrowed in immediate suspicion and calculation. She excused herself from her table, glass in hand, and approached me with that patented, patronizing high school swagger that had only grown more polished with corporate power. Well, if it isn't little Tessa Ward," she announced, loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding cluster of guests. The tone was saccharine, dripping with false warmth that barely masked the contempt. "Still hustling those small-time gigs? I heard you were doing some freelance work. Good for you for sticking with it, dear." Laughter followed her words like trained dogs, sharp and obedient. It was the same laughter I had heard 25 years ago, just amplified by expensive champagne. This was the moment she expected me to crumble, to offer a weak defense, or to hastily retreat. But my smile didn't falter. It remained fixed, serene, and entirely impenetrable. I met her gaze evenly, allowing a beat of silence to stretch between us. "Actually, Heather," I replied, my voice soft but steady, forcing her to lean in slightly to hear me over the din of the room. "Business is expanding. Quite dramatically, in fact." I offered no details, no defense, just that simple, undeniable statement of fact. Her eyes narrowed further, searching for the lie, the weakness, the old Tessa. She found nothing but quiet confidence. The insult had landed, but it had bounced right off the armor. The tables hadn't turned yet, but the first corner of the cloth was beginning to lift. The host of the reunion, a local news anchor who had also been a classmate, stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone to silence the crowd. This was the official portion of the evening, the showcasing of the alumni who had truly made it. "Tonight, we celebrate the incredible success stories of the class of 2000, he boomed, his voice echoing through the speakers. A slideshow began to play on the large screens positioned around the room. We watched as images of successful classmates flashed by, doctors, lawyers, financiers. Then came Heather's segment. Her picture filled the screen, smiling, poised, flanked by corporate logos. The host read her accolades. Chief Brand Officer, instrumental in the upcoming Marks and Hill merger, a true titan of industry. She preened slightly at her table, accepting the adulation with practiced humility. I watched her, my expression unchanged, knowing that this peak moment of her public victory was about to become the prelude to her professional nightmare. The host smiled, turning toward the center of the room. "And tonight," he continued, his tone shifting to one of genuine excitement, "we also want to recognize a remarkable entrepreneurial success story. Someone who built an industry leader from the ground up, quietly and brilliantly. Please join me in celebrating the founder of Ward Creative Agency, the firm currently redefining corporate identity across the nation. Gasps rippled through the crowd, immediate and audible. The name, Ward Creative Agency, was clearly recognized by the business-minded attendees. Heads swiveled, searching the room for the mysterious high-profile figure. Heather blinked rapidly, her smile freezing on her face as she tried to reconcile the name with the woman she had just insulted. Her eyes landed on me, standing quietly by the bar, and the realization dawned on her, slow and agonizing. She looked from me to the screen, then back to me, her jaw slackening. The host meanwhile gestured toward me. I took a deep breath, set my glass down and stepped away from the bar, walking toward the stage with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who belongs exactly where they are. I didn't need to rush. The scene had to play out perfectly. Wait, you're Ward Creative? Heather choked out the question, her voice barely a whisper, the polished veneer finally cracking. I stopped just short of the stage, turning slightly so the light caught the expensive fabric of my suit. I met her terrified gaze, and for the first time in 25 years, I let the full truth of my success shine in my eyes. I gave a small, deliberate nod. Surprise, I said, the word simple and final. Her wine glass slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the carpet with a dull thud, the sound barely registering over the sudden, intense silence that had fallen over the entire reunion hall. The broke girl was gone. The quiet millionaire had arrived. The host, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding between us, continued his introduction, completely sealing Heather's fate in the process. He launched into the details of Ward Creative's recent achievements, his voice growing louder and more celebratory. Ward Creative Agency recently secured the branding and integration contract for one of the largest corporate mergers this year, a partnership that includes the formidable Marks & Hill Corporation. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Marks & Hill. Heather's company. The gasp that followed this announcement was louder than the first, a collective realization among the business professionals in the room. I allowed the murmurs to build, letting the attendees process the fact that the woman who had just been publicly ridiculed was now the operational linchpin for the company of the woman who had insulted her. I stepped onto the stage, taking the microphone from the host. I glanced directly at Heather, who looked like she might faint, and offered a final, devastating clarification. Which means, of course, I added kindly, my voice ringing clearly through the speakers, that Ward Creative will be working closely with the executive team at Marks & Hill to ensure a smooth transition. Specifically with the Chief Brand Officer. We'll be working closely. Again. The word again was the knife twist, a quiet, professional acknowledgement of our history. The stolen project, the pink slip, the betrayal, now delivered back to her with devastating corporate finality. Heather's composure shattered completely. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and sickly under the ballroom lights. Her hands, which had been clutching the edge of the table, went slack. She stumbled back a step, her eyes wide, darting desperately toward the head table. Her boss, a senior partner at Marks & Hill who was also an alumnus and seated nearby, had been listening intently. He turned to Heather sharply, his expression shifting instantly from casual reunion chatter to intense professional scrutiny. The whispers that had been spreading across the room now coalesced into a focused, low roar of speculation. Everyone understood the implication. The woman who was just lauded as a success story was now professionally subordinate to the person she had just mocked as a low-level freelancer. Worse, the person in charge of her company's most critical high-stakes rebranding was someone she had deeply wronged in the past. The scrutiny from her boss was the final blow. I watched her shoulders slump, the expensive dress suddenly looking like a sack. She mumbled a hurried, almost frantic apology to the people at her table, claiming a sudden migraine, and then quickly, almost scrambling, she excused herself. She didn't look back. She simply walked out of the reunion hall, leaving the room buzzing with the electric energy of professional drama and personal downfall. Karma, I thought, watching the empty space where she had stood, truly had a flawless sense of timing. My revenge didn't require shouting or dramatic confrontation. It required only a clear, undeniable demonstration of superior power and position, delivered on the stage she had sought to dominate. The rest of the evening transformed into a bizarre, surreal procession. The moment Heather fled, the energy in the room shifted entirely. Suddenly, I was the magnetic center of attention. Old classmates, the same ones who had either ignored me or laughed at the Honda joke just an hour prior, began to approach my table. They came in waves, their faces plastered with expressions of awestruck admiration and clumsy attempts at flattery. "Tessa, I always knew you had it in you," chirped a former cheerleader whose name I barely recalled. "Your agency's work is legendary. We should grab coffee next week." A former football star, now a mid-level manager, clapped me on the shoulder too enthusiastically. "We've been looking for a creative partner. We should talk synergy." They were fawning, flattering, attempting to retrofit a narrative where they had always been supportive, always recognized my potential. I smiled politely at each one, engaging in brief, professional small talk, careful not to offer any genuine connection. Inside I felt only a profound, quiet peace. Their sudden approval, their desperate attempts to align themselves with my success, meant absolutely nothing. I had spent 10 years working for my own validation, and I no longer needed their belief, their recognition, or their friendship. I had outgrown their superficial world of high school hierarchies and corporate ladder climbing. I was standing on a completely different plane. I was polite but utterly inaccessible. I accepted their cards, promised my assistant would be in touch, and slowly, deliberately, closed the door on their attempts at reconciliation. The ultimate power was realizing that their opinion, whether positive or negative, held zero weight in my life. A month later, the news broke, not with a dramatic public announcement, but with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a corporate press release. I was in a meeting with my executive team when my COO discreetly handed me a printout of an article from a major business journal. The headline was clinical: Marks and Hill merger. Leadership changes announced. The article detailed the shuffling of executive roles following the recent merger integration. Specifically, it mentioned that Heather Marks was quietly removed from her executive role after an internal audit revealed ethical breaches and mismanagement of key vendor relationships. The language was sanitized, but the meaning was clear. Her downfall wasn't a direct result of my revenge. It was a consequence of her own flawed character, finally exposed under the intense scrutiny that my agency's high-profile involvement had brought to her department. I hadn't needed to orchestrate her firing or spread rumors. I had simply held a mirror up to her professional conduct, and the pressure of dealing with the now powerful victim of her past deceit had caused her existing cracks to widen and shatter. I read the article once, folded the paper neatly, and placed it on the corner of my desk. There was no elation, only a sense of definitive closure. She had failed not because I had actively destroyed her, but because she had built her career on sand, stealing projects and exploiting others. Now, the natural erosion of time and justice had finally made her foundation collapse. One cool, crisp morning, a few weeks after the news of Heather's departure had faded from the headlines, I found myself driving past our old high school. It wasn't planned. I was on my way to a client meeting and took a detour almost subconsciously. I parked my car, a sleek, anonymous black sedan that bore no resemblance to the old Honda, and simply watched the morning activity. Students were milling about, carrying backpacks and laughing, their lives still ahead of them, full of potential and unseen pitfalls. For the first time, I didn't feel the familiar sharp jab of bitterness or the dull ache of the old trauma. The cafeteria, the betrayal, the shame, they were all still there, etched into my memory, but they were distant, muted. They were history, not present reality. I felt only a profound sense of closure. I had spent so many years defining myself by the struggle to overcome that past, that I hadn't realized how much of my energy was still tied up in resentment. But now, seeing the physical building that represented so much pain, I felt nothing but peace. I watched the sunrise paint the brick walls in soft, golden light. I sat there for 10 minutes, realizing that the victory wasn't the money or the humiliation of Heather. The victory was the complete internal separation from the person I had been forced to be. I whispered to the empty car, "This is what healing looks like." I started the engine, pulled away from the curb, and drove toward my meeting, leaving the ghost of Tessa Ward, the poor girl, permanently behind the walls of that old school. Back in my office, which occupies the entire top floor of a downtown skyscraper, I stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling window. The city sprawled beneath me, a complex tapestry of ambition and commerce, a world I now influenced. My team was gathered around the conference table, their voices low and focused as they discussed the next quarter's campaigns, Huge, complex projects for international clients. I listened to their capable, professional chatter, the sound of a well-oiled machine humming with efficiency. I had built all of this. Everything they said I couldn't have, everything they laughed at me for not possessing, I had constructed with my own hands, fueled by the memory of every slight. I was no longer defined by their contempt. I was defined by my creation. I smiled, a genuine private smile that no one else needed to see. I turned my gaze back to the window, the morning light catching the dust motes dancing in the air. I whispered the final, most important realization, the true summation of my long, patient journey. They laughed when I was broke. But I built something they could never touch. Peace. And with that final, satisfying thought, I turned away from the window, away from the past and back toward the conference table. The world didn't need to witness or understand the intricate details of my revenge. It was already fully realized, living quietly and powerfully in every breath I took, every decision I made and every corner office I now commanded. My victory was complete.